So before we dive into Malachi, there was one kind of holdover from last class that I wanted to just make a note about because I didn't answer it very well, and so turn back with me just briefly to Nehemiah Chapter 10, and we won't spend a lot of time on this, but it did come up, and I thought it was probably worth following up on. Nehemiah Chapter 10, and let's look at verses 35 and 36. So remember, this is what Nehemiah and Ezra kind of were the instigators of a lot of the priests and Levites signing this covenant. Here are the things that we're going to obligate ourselves to. And it really wasn't anything new particularly. They were just going to obligate that they were going to keep the law that was already established. But verse 35 and 36, there was a question about one of these things. It says, we obligate ourselves to bring the first fruits of the ground and the first fruits of all fruit of every tree, and year by year to the house of the Lord, and to bring to the house of our God, to the priests who minister in the house of our God, the firstborn of our sons and our cattle, as is written in the law. So the question about the firstborn of the sons, were they obligating themselves that they were the firstborn son of every family was going to be just handed over to the temple? The answer to that, which I had knew at one point but had forgotten, so went back and kind of looked, and turned with me to Numbers chapter 18. So did God, they were to give God the first fruits of their crops and the first fruits of their herds. Were they also to give the first fruits of their family? The answer is actually yes. So Numbers 18, beginning in verse 14. And you'll note, let's go back for just a moment. You'll note back in verse 8, the Lord is speaking to Aaron. This is the context of where we are. The Lord is speaking to Aaron as we're establishing the law, and he's talking about the contributions that are going to be given to the Levites for their upkeep. Right? So the Levites had spiritual service that they provided, and here's how the Lord provided for their upkeep. And he talks about all the offerings and all the things they were to be given. So then skip down with me to verse 14. Every devoted thing in Israel shall be yours. Talking to Aaron, and by implication to all the Levites. Every devoted thing in Israel will be yours. Everything that opens the womb of all flesh, whether man or beast, which they offer to the Lord, will be yours. Nevertheless, the firstborn of man you will redeem, and the firstborn of unclean animals you will redeem. And the redemption price, at a month old, you'll redeem them. You will fix at 5 shekels in silver, according to the shekel of the sanctuary, which is 20 gerahs. So this is the thing today. If you are a Jewish mother and father, and if both parents are Jewish, and you have a firstborn male child, that you take this child to the Jewish representative. There's a Aramaic name for that. It escapes me. But you take that, and you literally give 5 shekels. You give your child to the Jewish official, and then you literally buy him back with 5 shekels. And so it's kind of a roundabout way of providing for the Levites again, that the firstborn of your family is theirs, and then you buy them back for 5 shekels. So it's still 5 shekels. There hadn't been any inflation in that number in 23,000 years, but 5 shekels will still buy your son back from the Levites. So that's the answer to that question. It's probably more than you wanted to know. But you literally buy your kid back from the Levites for 5 shekels. So if you ever need to do that. So now to Malachi chapter 1. The first question that you may be asking is, why are we studying Malachi in this class? So that's probably the right place to start. Why skip? It's a long way in your Bible from Nehemiah to Malachi. Right? There's a lot of pages in between there. So why are we studying Malachi in this class? Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
He was contemporary, and he was at the same time as Ezra and Nehemiah.
There is very, very good evidence to support that may be the case. And if you didn't hear Miss Carroll, she said it's very likely that he was a contemporary, perhaps, of Ezra and Nehemiah. Malachi is particularly difficult to pinned down. There's not a lot of internal evidence in the book about when it was written. It's not one of these prophets that says in the 10th year of King so-and-so. It doesn't give any clear indication of when it was written. In fact, we don't know, anybody have the chance to look in, what do we know about Malachi? Not a lot. Carol says his name means my messenger. There's some debate over even whether that's a real name that his mama gave him or whether that's just the name he used to write the book. We know very, very little about the person of Malachi. And so because of that, we really don't know, we can't point back to any other reference in Scripture. That we know of, there's nowhere else in Scripture that he's referenced. And so exactly when he prophesied is somewhat difficult. So why do we, there is some evidence, as Carol said, that he would have been a contemporary or lived at the same time as Ezra and Nehemiah. Anybody want to do any study on what are those facts? Like, why do we think that he's prophesying at the same time as these guys?
He talks about a governor, and that's what was happening with Persia. They had governors.
Yeah, so there's a lot of, if you look into the commentaries on this, there is a lot of emphasis put on this verse 8 of chapter 1 when it says, would you present that to your governor? That specific word is the same word that's used when Nehemiah says that he was governor. It's a Persian derivative word, and it indicates that we are in this time period when there are Persian governors. So, as we've looked at, the timeline, there's a lot of time that Persia was the world empire, but we can narrow it down that far. We're in the time of Persian rule. Pretty confident about that just based on that word. Would you give that to your Persian governor? A couple other things that are just kind of worth noting. Some of the main issues that Malachi brings up are the exact same issues that Nehemiah is dealing with. So let's just look at that just real quick. Chapter 2, and I think we read these verses in the last class, but Malachi chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. Somebody care to read those for me?
For the lips of the priest should guard knowledge, and people should seek instruction from his mouth, because he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. You, on the other hand, have turned from the way. You have caused many to stumble by your instruction. You have violated the covenant of Levi, says the Lord.
So, a couple of things to note in that passage from Malachi is that the priests have caused people to stumble. Very specific phrase, you have corrupted the covenant of Levi. Note that, there's a specific turn of phrase there. You've corrupted the covenant of Levi. All right, now turn back with me to Nehemiah chapter 13, which we haven't studied yet. We'll do that in our last class of the quarter. But Nehemiah chapter 13, and check out verse 29. This is the issue that Nehemiah is dealing with in his time period. Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 29. Remember them, O my God, because they have, and note his specific language here, they have desecrated the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. They've desecrated the covenant of the Levites. It's almost the same language that Malachi uses when he says that they have corrupted the covenant of Levi. Very interesting that those two, Nehemiah and Malachi, use the same language to tackle the issue that they are facing. Also, I hope you've held your fingers there. We're going to go back real quick to Malachi chapter 2 and verse 11. So there's kind of evidence number one is the use of the word governor. There's a Persian word, kind of puts us in a certain time frame. Evidence number two, the priests have corrupted the covenant of Levi. That's used in both books, interestingly. And then in Malachi chapter 2 and verse 11, one of the things that Malachi notes is Judah has been faithless and abominations have been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem, for Judah has profaned the sanctuary of the Lord and has married the daughter of a foreign god. Israel has profaned the sanctuary of the Lord. What would the sanctuary of the Lord be in the time of Nehemiah? The temple. Yep, very good. So Malachi says, you've profaned the sanctuary, you've profaned the temple, and married the daughter of a foreign god. All right, one more time, let's flip back to Nehemiah. This is a good exercise just in finding Nehemiah in your Bible, right? Nehemiah chapter 13, one more time, in verse 7. Again, we'll study more on this when we tackle chapter 13 specifically, but one of the major issues that Nehemiah deals with in the last chapter of his book is this in chapter 7. And I came to Jerusalem, Nehemiah 13, verse 7, and I came to Jerusalem, and I discovered the evil that Eliashib, the high priest, had done for Tobiah. Remember, he's one of the foreigners who's trying to defeat Nehemiah. He had prepared for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber, and I gave orders that they cleanse the chamber, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. So quite literally, the high priest had done what? Profaned the temple by bringing a foreigner into and allowing them to have essentially a home in the temple. This Gentile was given that had not a proselyte to Judaism, didn't worship God, but he'd been given this place of honor in the temple. That sounds very similar to me to Malachi 2 and verse 11. Judah has been faithless, abominations have been committed, and Judah has profaned the sanctuary which the Lord loves and married the daughter of a foreign god. Anyway, just think those parallels are pretty. Again, we can't be definitive. We can't be just 100% sure that we're talking about exactly the same incidents. Israel had a handy way of doing the same dumb stuff over and over again. So we can't be sure we're talking about exactly the same incidents. But man, there seems like there's a lot of similarities between what Nehemiah dealt with and what Malachi is prophesying against. So, all that being said, by way of introduction, it would be my contention that Malachi fits right into the book of Nehemiah as far as timeline. That this last burst of prophetic activity, God is going to send one last messenger to the people during the time of Nehemiah to try to get them to clean up their act in the temple. And so Malachi may well, and perhaps you've been told, and Malachi is the last book written in the Old Testament. That is very possibly true, but I would tell you that I think Nehemiah and Malachi are right together. So I think that's just where it fits in the timeline. So that is the extremely long-winded answer to the question of why are we studying Malachi? Because I think it fits. And because it seems that God provided Malachi to give Nehemiah support in the things that he was trying to do in Nehemiah chapter 13. So those two names, in my opinion, should be connected in our minds. Not just Ezra and Nehemiah, but Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi. We're doing God's work together at the same time. So that's why we got here. So our goal tonight is to, any questions or comments, thoughts about that? Anything else, just background to Malachi that anybody noted in their own study that we need to, that we should note here? I'm sorry?
His style of writing.
Yeah, so that's question number one. Thank you. Good segue. You're going to try to just kick me along to actually get to the questions, huh? Question number one. So after reading chapter 1, how would you describe the writing style of Malachi? How would you describe it? It's unique. You could use that word. It's somewhat unique. I don't know that there's any other book that's kind of structured in this way. So how would you describe it? How's it structured? It's very conversational. Yes, it's almost a script in some ways. It's very conversational, and it's a good word. I should have used that word. That God makes a statement through Malachi. Malachi provides what the people of Israel, what their response is by way of their actions. Here's how you respond to that, and then here's God's response to that. And so it's very kind of question and answer. That over and over again we see this pattern of Malachi gives God's statement and then provides for us how the people would respond or how they were responding with their actions. And then God responds to that. And then the responses of the people, the responses of Israel are often given in the form of a question. And so God says something, and the people say, well, how is that true? And then God responds to that. And the people say, well, how is that true? And God responds to that. We see that pattern. I think it's kind of interesting. It's just kind of a unique, somewhat engaging way of getting our attention. I think it's interesting, and it makes Malachi unique. I think it is somewhat engaging. Any other comments about his writing style that you noticed?
That style of question and answer is called Socratic.
Oh, college girl.
For like 30 minutes today, I couldn't find it, but it's written right here in the Bible.
What is it?
Socratic.
The Socratic Method, ask and answer.
Teaching that you ask a question, they repeat the question back and forth, and it makes them remember it.
Yes. So this method of providing question and answer as a way to engage and get everybody thinking, kind of the Socratic method. I like that. Also say that like Haggai and Zechariah, we could pull you back into remembering those prophets for just a moment. They use this term, the Lord of hosts, or the Lord of heaven's armies, the Lord of hosts, depending on what version you have. That phrase is not used. It's used some, but not very often. Before you get to Haggai, Haggai uses it a bunch. Zechariah uses it a lot, and Malachi uses it a lot. Just interesting that during this time period that we're studying, that became a very popular way to talk about God, the Lord of hosts, the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of heaven's armies. Why that's the case is probably an interesting thought experiment. I don't know that I know the answer, but Malachi uses that a lot, the Lord of hosts, just like Haggai and Zechariah did. So just that's something else about his writing style. So we talked about that the responses from Israel in this conversational kind of dialogue, that the responses from Israel are often in the form of a question, and that's our question too. What questions does Israel ask, or what? I'm sorry, let me ask the question. What statements of God does Israel refute in chapter 1? God says something, and then the nation refutes it. So what? I counted at least 3 times that happened in the first chapter. What were those instances? One more time. How have you loved us? So that's verse 2, right? So God makes this what would appear to be a pretty benign statement coming from Malachi. That the Lord says, I have loved you. Yeah, I mean, that's like God 101. That's a pretty base level understanding. I have loved you. And yet the people come back with the response of what? How have you loved us? How have you loved us? That's a pretty interesting response, right? A pretty bold thing to say to God. How have you shown your love to us? Why do you think that children of Israel in this time might be inclined to answer that way? Why would they say, how have you loved us?
Well, they haven't been engaged in worshiping God.
Okay.
Then they don't realize what He has actually done for them.
So that's a good point. And Carol notes, we talked about how much did the people know or had been taught of the law. When Ezra came to read the law, people seemed like they were kind of blindsided by it. They didn't have a good grasp of the law. Maybe they truly didn't understand what God had done. Okay? What else?
They were so sad when they came back and the temple was not in its former glory and everything had been taken from them, and they saw that was never going to be. They're only seeing physical. Saw that was never going to be what it once was.
Yeah. So if you think about if I could take what Tara said, if you think about from the perspective of a Jew, you're a slave in what God has told you was the promised land. if you take that in the wrong frame of mind or with the wrong mindset, you would say, God, you haven't shown love to us. You promised us the promised land, and now we're slaves. We don't have our own king. We don't have our own country. We're a province of Persia. How have you loved us? That's kind of the entitled, selfish response to God saying, I have loved you. You say, you haven't loved us. We're slaves. We don't even have our own king. We don't have our own country. We're supposed to be this great kingdom of Solomon, of the line of David that you promised. And here we are, we got this ratty little city, and we're not even our own people. How have you loved us? So that kind of leads to God's answer, and we'll talk about that in question number 3. So that was the first one. God says pretty simply, I have loved you, and they say, how have you loved us? What's the second statement that they refute?
Son honors his father and serving his master.
Yes. And specifically down at the end of verse 6, and that's where Freda is, O priests who despise my name. I think it's interesting he's speaking specifically to the priest. We talked last time about how the priesthood had been corrupted, and how that continued to happen through the next several hundred years all the way to Christ. The priesthood had been pretty thoroughly corrupted. O priests who despise my name. And then how did they respond to that? How have we despised your name? That's, God, we would never do that. How have we done that? We have not despised your name. And we'll talk more about how they had done that. That'd be question 4. And then the last statement they refute. I don't know. One more time? Yes. And so when God says, you've despised me, the priests respond, how have we despised your name? God says, by offering polluted food on my altar, verse 7. And they respond, how have we polluted you? You get this we can do no wrong kind of mentality, this kind of entitled, hey, we're God's chosen people, we're good here kind of mentality. How have we polluted you? We've done everything that you asked. So we get those 3 statements. We'll have actually more in chapter 2, but in chapter 1, I know of those 3 specifically. How have we loved you? How have we despised your name? How have we polluted you? Response to God. Any other thoughts on that question? All right, let's get into this question 3, and this gets into that first statement of how have you loved us. So how does the comparison of Jacob and Esau demonstrate God's love to Israel? Let's tackle that question first. So when Israel responds, Malachi's again writing this out as dialogue. God says, I love you. Israel says, how have you loved us? And God immediately, through Malachi, launches into this comparison of Jacob and Esau. So what do we learn from that? How does the comparison of Jacob and Esau show God's love to Israel?
Love Jacob less, that is said. I don't know, I was just going to ask you, the way I understood this, he was actually saying, expressing his love in a negative sense, in that I have punished them harder than I've punished you. I mean, it's an odd use of love.
Yes.
He was displeased with both of them.
Yes.
But he says, I've loved you because I did not do to you what I did to them.
I think Roger's point is a very good one, is that the comparison, so he said Jacob and Esau, and we know Jacob and Esau as the twin sons of Isaac, right? They were both sons of Abraham, or descendants of Abraham, they're both sons of Isaac. And the descendants of Esau formed what nation? Edom, yeah. And obviously the sons of Jacob formed Israel and Judah. And this comparison of how God says that where Edom was at this time versus where Judah was. Where was Edom at this time? It's off the map. Yeah, it's off the map. And it's off the map today. You can't go to your travel agent and book a ticket to Edom. It ain't there. So it doesn't exist. So it's off the map. Were the sins of Judah worse? Let me rephrase that the other way. Were the sins of Edom worse than the sins of Judah? Is that why they were punished more strictly? Is it because? No, I'm going to say no. I think there's definite evidence that many times God says that the abominations of Judah were worse than those of the nations round about. That Judah was the best at getting stuff wrong and defiling God's name and treating the poor corruptly and worshiping idols and all the things that we read about through Isaiah and Jeremiah. So if the sins of Edom weren't any worse than the sins of Judah, Edom's been wiped off the map, but Judah still exists. Why?
They were chosen.
God's promise to Abraham and God's love for Israel. Remember, God told Israel back in the days of Moses, it's not because you're the largest nation that I love you. It's not because you're the most holy nation that I love you, but because I chose you. I chose you to love you. And so can you imagine what an affront to God it is when that nation says, how have you loved us? Like that's got to be pretty much a slap in the face. How have you loved us? Like, you still exist. Edom does not. Not because you were better than they were, but because I've loved you.
Michael, isn't that what the significance of where he says that the Lord had not left us a remnant, we would have been like Sodom and Gomorrah?
Yes. So Roger notes the passage, if the Lord had not left a remnant, we would be like Sodom and Gomorrah. That there wasn't much difference between Judah and Edom. Had there not been this remnant of exiles, they would be Edom, that the land would be desolate. There would not be a temple. There wouldn't be a wall for Nehemiah to rebuild. But God loved his people. God had the promise to Abraham and the people that he had chosen. And so he brought them back against all odds to repopulate, this city that had been destroyed. And so Edom didn't have that opportunity. How have you loved us? Well, just compare how I've treated Judah, how I've treated Edom, both descendants of Abraham. So I think that's interesting. That God's love for Israel is just in the simple fact that they exist, in the preservation of this remnant of these exiles. Because Judah was not more holy than Edom, and yet they exist. Edom didn't. And so the other thing that's interesting about this passage is how it's used in the New Testament. So how is this same passage from Malachi Chapter 1, first, where is it used in the New Testament, and then how is it used? So Romans Chapter 9, we see this quote from the book of Malachi. So first I'll note that the fact that Paul is quoting from the book of Malachi should cement for us Malachi's validity, right? It's inspired because Paul is quoting it. That's important. Note that first. But he notes it in the beginning of chapter 9, and I won't make us kind of read the whole first part of chapter 9, but hopefully you had a chance to do that. So what's the point of that text? Why does Paul use this comparison between Jacob and Esau in Romans chapter 9?
So, just my thought to show that what happened was strictly God's choice.
Yes.
And God purposed things. This will be what happens for the disobedient. This will be the way it is for the obedient.
And he certainly gets into that in verse 14 and following, that it is not based on human exertion, but on God's will. That this choice of the treatment of the two brothers.
Contrast the children of flesh with the children of promise. So the Edomites represent, they're all descendants of Abraham, so the Israelites represent, or the Edomites represent the children of flesh, and then the Israelites represent the children of promise, which ends up in now all of us who are spiritual Israel. And none of that could have happened if he hadn't preserved physical Israel in the
So, and that's the point I think Paul's making in the first part of the chapter, and I'll try to repeat what Tara said there, is remember, Paul is writing to try to help all the Jews and Gentiles kind of understand the grafting in of the Gentiles into Christianity. And so he's making this point in the first part of Romans chapter 9 that says, hey, being a descendant of Abraham didn't guarantee that you were holy. How am I going to prove that? Well, was Esau a descendant of Abraham? Yes, for sure. So Esau was a descendant of Abraham, and his people left the rails and were wiped off. I mean, they don't exist. So just a descendant, being a descendant of Abraham is not a guarantee that you're one of God's chosen. And then it makes pretty interesting, it's not our study for tonight, but it's pretty interesting in verse 6. He says, not even those who are descended from Israel, or Jacob, not even those who are descended from Israel are really Israel. That the true Israel, the spiritual Israel, doesn't have to do with being descended from Jacob, but it has to do with those who follow God's word. And he kind of uses this comparison of Jacob and Esau to make that point. But I think verse 6 is really interesting and to help us kind of understand what spiritual Israel is about. Not even all who are descended from Israel belong to true Israel. Again, just kind of interesting how he uses that passage from Malachi to make that point about lineage is not nearly as important as spiritual, being a spiritual child of Abraham.
He mentions in other places in the New Testament that those that are of the faith of Abraham
Yes.
are Abraham's true.
Yes, those who are of faith are Abraham's seed. And I think that's the point of the first part of, yeah, good point. Galatians somewhere, I think. So this idea from Malachi is very relevant even in our studies of the New Testament, especially there in Romans chapter 9. So God chose that Judah would have a remnant, and that he makes that point very clear in Romans chapter 9, and that's how Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. We don't like that phrase. It sounds too harsh, but it's just a comparison that he did keep that remnant from Judah and not from Edom. Okay. Any other questions or comments about that passage? Question 4. So there's what I feel is a really, really interesting phrase in chapter 1. Verse 10. I'm in Malachi chapter 1, verse 10. Oh, that there were one among you who would shut the doors, that you might not kindle useless fire on my altar. I wish somebody'd shut the doors. That's a pretty heavy statement. What are the implications of God asking the temple doors to be shut? What do you think? What is God trying to say? What are the implications of that? So Carol says that what is happening in the temple is not true worship. So that's a good place to start.
Sacrifices that aren't always the best, and their hearts aren't in it.
It's their hearts aren't in it, she notes, and that seems pretty clear. What specifically is noted in Malachi chapter 1 about the way that they were worshiping? Offering polluted sacrifices. That's Malachi's word. Yeah, and how were they polluted? Yes, they were lame and sick, verse 8. They were blemished, verse 14. Those are the exact words that are noted in Deuteronomy chapter 15 as the kind of animals that should not have been offered to God in sacrifice. Not that it is not that this was just an indicator that they didn't take it seriously, although certainly it was. This was just a blatant disregard for black and white law. Like the law didn't say offer a lamb, and they offered a poor one, which was not a good choice on their part. The law said don't offer a blemished and lame sacrifice, and they offered a blemished and lame sacrifice. It was more than just they didn't give their best. They blatantly violated the clear commandment. So we shouldn't sugarcoat or water that down that, well, they just didn't give God their best. That's true, but they also clearly and blatantly violated a very clear commandment. Don't offer me blind sacrifices, and that's what they did. It was pretty blatant and pretty black and white. And so because of that, God says, I wish you'd just shut the doors. So what are the implications of saying, I wish you'd shut the doors? It couldn't be done. And so is God saying, I would prefer no worship? He said, I would, that's a good, expound on that. I didn't see that one coming. Expound on that. That's a good thought.
He didn't really want a temple anyway. He told David, I don't want a temple.
I don't dwell in a house made with hands.
But he let them go ahead, and then now these corrupt priests have come in, and it's just terrible.
So God would prefer no worship happen in the temple as compared to this worship happening in the temple. Is that fair? Seems like that's what he's saying.
Well, Michael, the true worship starts with the priests, and here Malachi is calling the priests out. If they're not teaching the people true worship,
Yes.
then they're causing them to stumble.
And so Carol makes a great point. This all starts with the priests and with the teaching and the furthering of understanding the law. Can't you just see that that's where all this starts? Ezra had to bring the law because the people didn't know it. And so the priests were completely, failing on their responsibility to teach the law because the law wasn't being taught. The priests, could do less than what God required, and no one could hold them accountable because nobody knew the law. You just have this cycle of lack of understanding. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, Hosea chapter 5, maybe 6. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, and it's a cycle of the priests don't teach, and so the next generation of priests don't know, and there's corruption, and it gets worse and worse, to the point where God says, I just would prefer you shut the doors. I just think that is a really, really, what a damning comment. Guys, if this is what you got, just stay home. That's pretty heavy. So rather than worship that God says despises his name. And what kind of worship does he note specifically that despises his name? We already mentioned one, the offering of sacrifices that has clearly been commanded that is not acceptable. This stuff is not acceptable, but it's what you're offering. So I think that's one.
There's also an element of arrogance there that when they say, how have we despised your name? How are we we're worshiping, we're giving our sacrifices. And so something I wrote down was worship where we boast in ourselves. We're doing all these things you said to do as if we can earn some kind of favor from God that we don't deserve through our feeble efforts at checking things off the list.
There's definitely an element of arrogance, as Tara knows. Have we despised your name? We're keeping these sacrifices. We're doing them at morning and at night, just like you say. And you get a little bit of that, I think, also in verse 13, where it says, what a weariness this is. Maybe your version reads that a little bit differently, but 2 sacrifices a day, that's a lot. We're staying super busy doing all this sacrificing you want us to do. This is a lot of work. The arrogance and the just the low priority given to God in that, where he says, I would prefer that you shut the doors. So the second part of the question is, how do you think that could be relevant to us?
Well, what come to my mind was, do we have to go back to church Sunday night?
Yes, that what a weariness it is is a
Well, I go to hell if I miss.
yeah. What a weariness it is a straight line to, do I have to attend every service? I mean, I don't know how you can disconnect those. That is like a pretty distinct parallel. Do I have to attend every service? What a weariness it is. I think that's a very good parallel. Yes, sir.
Also, is your heart right with God when you're there in
Yes.
the pew?
Yes.
And are you doing true worship? Do you have a communion?
Yeah, because apparently being present
Isn't all.
isn't isn't the test. Because they were present, and God says, I'd prefer you not be present, just to be real honest. Is there a New Testament parallel to that? I believe that there is. And some of you may have had this verse noted. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 17. I think there's a pretty interesting parallel between Malachi 1 and 1 Corinthians chapter 11. The specific context is the Lord's Supper, but I'm not sure this is limited only to the Lord's Supper. But Paul tells the brethren in Corinth, in the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it's not for the better, but for the worse. That sounds a lot like it'd be better off if we shut the doors. Because the way you guys are doing this, it's not for the better. Like, you're worse for coming together. Think about that comment. You guys are worse off because you're coming together. That's a pretty damning comment about the worship in Corinth. In the way that it was not glorifying to God. It was not according to the pattern. It was not as God intended. It was de-edifying. It was tearing them down. It was not building them up.
Dad's point, James talks about what pure and undefiled religion is, what's not despising God, and that definitely takes into account coming here to worship, but it's not, the test isn't what we do here. The test is what we do out there, what we're doing to practice that pure and undefiled religion to spread the gospel.
Yes, and what is our heart outside of the building definitely affects what we bring to the building as well. Is there a trap of Malachi out there? Is it possible that we come together and it's not to God's glory? Is it possible that we come together and it's not even to our benefit, like we're worse off for being here? Paul says that's possible. That's scary. That's we don't have time to dig much more into that, but I think that's good for all of our studies. How do we make sure that when we come together, it is to glory and to our benefit? And then real quick on verse 11, we don't have a lot of time on this. Depending on what version you have, verse 11 either sounds like it's a present tense thing or a future tense thing. And so if you've got the English Standard Version, it says, from the rising of the sun to its setting, my name will be great among the nations. If you got some other versions, it says, my name is great among the nations, as if it's happening right at that time. And so there's been some debate about, are these verses about a future time or about a present time? And so I'm talking specifically about kind of verse 11. Well, I guess it is just verse 11. I'll give my 2 cents in the time remaining and leave it to your study. Is that seems to me that it makes more sense as being messianic, as looking to a future time. Because was it true that God's name was great among all the nations in Malachi's day? Probably not. I mean, we know Persian king glorified God to some extent, but all the nations probably not. Was it true that incense will be offered to his name in all the nations? For sure not. But we know that does happen in the New Covenant. The prayers of the saints come up as an incense before God. That tracks. That there would be a pure offering. I mean, what offering was ever truly pure? It was Jesus. Hebrews 10 makes that point. So I definitely think that there's a little messianic burst there in the middle of chapter 1. So on Sunday, we will tackle chapter 2, 3, and 4 of Malachi, and look forward to seeing everybody then. Thanks for your help.